Welcome to the Thinking Practitioner Podcast,
a podcast where we dig into the fascinating issues, conditions, and quandaries in the massage and manual therapy world today.
I'm Whitney Lowe.
And I'm Luchau.
Welcome to the Thinking Practitioner.
The Thinking Practitioner Podcast is proudly supported by ABMP, Associated Bodywork and Massage Professionals, the premier association for dedicated massage and bodywork practitioners like you. When you join ABMP, you're not just getting industry-leading liability insurance, you're gaining practical resources designed to support your career. From free top-tier continuing education and quick reference apps like Pocket Pathology and 5-Minute Muscles, ABMP equips you with the tools you need to succeed and grow your practice.
And ABMP is committed to elevating the profession with expert voices, fresh perspectives, and invaluable insights through CE courses, the ABMP podcast, and Massage and Bodywork magazine, featuring industry leaders like my co-host Till and myself. Thinking Practitioner listeners like you can get exclusive savings on ABMP membership at abmp.com/thinking. So join the best and expect more from your professional association. Till, welcome back. Good to see you again. And we've got a wonderful guest with us here today.
Back to Whitney.
Yeah.
Today we're speaking with Dr. Stephen Porges, a distinguished neuroscientist, the originator of the Polyvagal Theory, and someone whose work has profoundly influenced how we understand safety, connection, and the nervous system. You might know, listeners, that Polyvagal Theory is a framework that explains why we can't heal sometimes or connect sometimes, or even think clearly when we don't feel safe. But it's a lot more than that. It's a window into how our bodies respond to each other and to the world around us. And in this conversation, I want to explore what polyvagal theory means for you body workers and how touch can support regulation and connection, and how we as practitioners can become even more attuned to our clients and ourselves. Welcome, Dr. Porges. Steve.
Well, thank you, Till, and thank you, Whitney.
Mm-hmm. Good to have you here.
It's great to have you here. And I'm actually really excited to talk to you. And the irony is that I've learned so much about what happens in excitement from your work indirectly. I first heard about your work through John Cottingham, who was teaching in a program I coordinated at the Rolf Institute, and then later Peter Levine, who taught in the same program, and learned a lot about calming and the ways that body work we were examining then might influence that, and how your work helped us understand that better. So you did some early research with John Cottingham, if I remember right. What drew you to do research in a bodywork context, and how has that early work shaped the evolution of your thinking?
Well, this is actually an interesting story. The bodywork connection actually came from Peter Levine, whom I met actually in the 1970s. And he was very intrigued with, this is long before he developed somatic experiencing. He was very intrigued with how touch and movement and massage and actually deep manipulations, deep fascial manipulations were changing what appeared to him to be autonomic state. So he kept engaging me. And, I was this young assistant professor in Illinois, and he was out on the West Coast, and we developed a relationship. And it's been a very strong relationship. And he brought me into the Rolfing community in the late 1970s. Actually, it's probably the late 1970s, actually would be more accurate.
Well, and people don't know that he trained as a Rolfer and was active in the Rolf Institute and had a big influence on what persisted there as well. He was on our show last year.
Yeah. So, Peter's a visionary. He's an explorer. And I'm pretty much, or at least was at that time, pretty much a structured laboratory scientist, but interested in human behavior and basically open to learning. And I was very intrigued. And it was interesting dialectic. And actually, let's get John Cottingham into the story next, and then we'll go to what I call the dialectic, and that is function and structure, which is really kind of the world that you folks come from. And whether you can change function through structure, or can you change structure through function, these become questions really that one can answer or ask. And the realization is they both are very important in the integration of what we call the human experience. But let's go to your question about John. John was, he had been in medical school, and you probably know this story about John. He had been in medical school and he became very frustrated with being in medical school and wanted to be a body worker. He wanted to study manipulation. So this is really going back to his engagement with me. So I was a faculty member at that time in Champaign, Illinois, where John was living. And John basically engaged, and he knew I had an interest in basically somatics and started to talk to me and with his passions. And basically, we got into this basically quid pro quo. He would do manipulations on me, and I would teach him basically the neurophysiology of what I thought he was doing, and then encourage
An amazing trade. Amazing.
yeah, so it was a very interesting bit. So it would be like, going through the 10 sessions, we he would manipulate me, then we go out for coffee for 2 hours and talk about it. Then the next week we do the same thing, and we built a very nice relationship. And then he got very interested in wanting to do research in this. And at that time, and actually I can give you the year now, because I developed a device that measured vagal regulation of the heart online. So that device was basically created in 1985, and John got use of one. He got a grant from the Fetzer Foundation to do some studying, basically of Rolfing manipulations. And I helped him really structure his research into research questions that had answers or could be answered. So we start with basically this simple question: what does pelvic tilt do to autonomic regulation? And that really was our first publication. And of course, when you tilt the pelvis, you are changing the sensory flow of the afferents from actually parasympathetic afferents going up the vagus. And sure enough, if you lift the pelvis up, you get more cardiac vagal tone. And what John was interested in was the angle of inclination. So he's getting into your world. So where people's pelvis is really tilted out of optimal range, and does it have a consequence on autonomic regulation? And so the inference of that study was, yes, it should have, because you can do the acute manipulation, and now we can start inferring about more chronic positioning. The second study was the deep massage. I can't remember the number of the session that it refers to within Rolfing, but it's deep abdominal massage.
And the fifth hour, but yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, I of course went through all this myself, and this is very profound. In a sense, you basically feel like a little bit like jelly afterwards. And the interesting part about this one is not only does it give you an acute reaction, but it stays up for a prolonged period of time. I'm not sure if it was days or hours. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But there are two publications in a credible journal called Physical Therapy with John on this. And I believe these were probably the first scientific papers published in Rolfing. And
that's how I got to know them. And yeah, I'll put links to them in the show notes.
Yeah.
And that was 1988. And yeah, I was looking at people with subjects with pelvic tilt. And the findings that we all talked about were that not only was there a change in the pelvic angle afterwards, but there was a change in their vagal tone.
Yeah.
That was the first thing of us had ever heard of that term.
Yeah.
But as you described, it's something you originated.
Yeah.
And
so it was really kind of a interesting issue that you can change the structure, and now you're getting a change in the function. And John then went on and got a master's in biology, and then he became a physical therapist. He went to Northwestern and got a degree in physical therapy. And actually, I don't know if he's still with us. He had been ill, and I sent it, I heard he had, I don't know, is he still with us?
I haven't been in touch with him for many years, so I don't know.
Yeah, but this was about 7 or 8 years ago. I was actually in contact with his wife, who told me he was ill. So I wrote to him, but I didn't get a response. So, but John, when we lived in Champaign, I would say John was a close friend. We'd go out for beers as well and coffee frequently. And on the side, we talk about professional wrestling. Okay.
He's a wonderful guy. I learned a lot from him.
So I'm curious about this study, and I wasn't really familiar with his work and the things that you all had looked into there. But was there a way when you had done that study to sort of discriminate that those results were specifically ascribed to the pelvic tilt and not just the manipulation of tissues in general, that they were having some kind of response to tissue
That's
manipulation in general?
interesting. I believe there was a hands-on type of thing as well, but they were specific to the manipulation.
If I remember, there was a control group that did have manipulation that was not specific.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay.
The dialogue that I used to get into is actually, especially, my view was very neural, a very neural perspective, and almost a dismissiveness over structure. It's kind of a strange world to be in. And I think my venture or entree into the somatics got me really to put it more together, to talk about the feedback loops of where structure is actually influencing neural. And this is really the start of that. It's actually developed more. And as you know, I'll be talking at the fascia meeting. And actually my talk is really looking at fascia through the lens of polyvagal theory.
This is the Fascial Research Congress in New Orleans coming up in August, and they are a in-kind sponsor of the show, so I should make sure that I underline that when you mention it. Yes.
Well, it's quite remarkable that if you take the lens of polyvagal theory, it forces you to ask evolution-oriented questions, because our nervous system changes as a function of evolution. The term we would use is phylogeny, as species change. And when we move from different, in a sense, groups of species, like moving from amphibia to mammals or amphibia to reptiles, these are major reorganizations or repurposing, is actually a better word, of structure. And there's what I'm really getting locked into now is looking at this phylogenetic or evolutionary transition in gene expression, how the organism at the level of a mammal uses structures differently than it would at the level of an amphibia or fish. So it's not like we don't share the common structures, but we've repurposed them. And it's that repurposing which makes things really interesting. But the interesting part is the hierarchy, and this is polyvagal theory. The polyvagal theory is really saying that our autonomic nervous system, the nervous system of our viscera, our organs, is actually a three-tiered system. It's a hierarchical system. And it follows its evolutionary history. And that is when we were very primitive vertebrates, then basically we're a viscera with a autonomic nervous system of what we in mammals would see as below the diaphragm, primarily a gut and metabolism organism. And then through evolution, we become an organism of movement, skeletal motor. And so we reframe autonomic function from supporting smooth muscle to supporting skeletal muscle. And then when mammals came off of this common ancestor that basically is the parent of both reptiles and mammals, it had certain attributes, and that is where the muscles of the face, in which were controlled by cranial nerves. Now, what I'm learning, and this is what I'm going to be talking about at the fascia meeting, is that each of those stages has different types of fascia. And the fascia with the more evolved vertebrates, or more evolved, meaning mammals, have much more sensory components in them. And that sensory connection has faster velocities. So our fascia becomes part of our autonomic nervous system. And that's really what the talk will be, is that even though when people are often taught anatomy, the fascia is ripped off, they don't even see the fascia.
Yeah.
Basic part is that the fascia is unique for cranial muscles regulated by the cranial nerves, muscles regulated by the thorax, and then muscles regulated by the visceral organs below the diaphragm. Now, the reason the diaphragm is critical in this story, and of course, in your world, you'll see it in terms of breathing and the movement of the chest wall, especially the rib cage, which is really big in bodywork. You can see it. When people are stressed, what happens to the rib cage is that the diaphragm is unique to mammals. It's just like having breasts or suckling and nursing, or it's unique to mammals. Reptiles don't have a diaphragm. And this is actually, well, it creates this demarcation where we can see things and understand it in this hierarchy. Because polyvagal theory talks about literally a facial system, or facial, which is listening, vocalization, smiling, broadcasting my physiology. And through evolution, that got linked with cardioinhibitory fibers, meaning vagal fibers, to the heart. So our face was basically broadcasting our physiological state. And what does that mean? Are we safe enough to come close to? So it's not only face, it's the voice. More intonation in the voice, more vagal tone to the heart, more facial expressivity, the same story. And when
then I'm thinking of breath rhythm too, as a way that we sync up or connect
or attempt to,
or miss to,
because we're trying to go in with the signal when the system may be so dysregulated it says I don't want to hear it. And so that's why breath work is wonderful, but not causal. That's why even a somatic work or touch is wonderful, but if the body is defensive, it's not going to incorporate those signals of safety and mobility or rhythmicity that you're describing.
So we can kind of, if I'm sort of getting this, Jim, this is fascinating, opening up a lot of things to think about with, reptiles and other birds in particular, other animals that don't have highly expressive facial features. So we can kind of then assume that that's something along what you're saying here is this is something that has developed along the evolutionary scale to this level of complexity in these other animal species.
But Whitney, we have to understand that when we bring up reptiles and birds, they have their own history. They've already split from mammals.
Yeah.
Reptiles split from mammals. So we can't learn too much from reptiles and birds. They're interesting in themselves. And your extracted point is correct. They do not have the same facial expressivity. In fact, most reptiles are not vocal at all. But birds can be very, evolved, lots of vocalization, a lot of communication through vocalizations. But they're not our relatives. They're our cousins. It's like they're not a direct lineage. The direct lineage goes through what's called a common ancestor. And that common ancestor really is the parent for both reptiles and mammals. And birds are part of that reptilian branching.
Yeah. I want to also just real quickly jump back to something that you said too when you were talking about the fascia being different in these different areas and having much more significant innervation, for example, along in the facial realm. Is that the main difference that you've noticed was level of innervation or the degree of innervation in there, or were there other things that you were able to?
Let's refine what we mean by innervation. We're really saying a stronger linkage between sensory pathways leading to the autonomic nervous system. And we would say feelings. So in the sense, the feelings, visceral feelings. So we have greater specificity with these newer circuits, like facial fascia has more basically specificity than thoracic or skeletal motor or visceral. Visceral is the oldest and it's the most diffuse. So we in fact, when we have pain below the diaphragm, we sometimes don't know really where it's coming from.
Harder to locate. We tend to be super practical as body workers. I know our audience questions are usually about like, okay, so what does this mean in practice? So we want to know where to touch and how. What I really appreciate about the influence you've had on me is it makes me see the interaction as the whole rather than just the touch part of it. But anyway, what insights can your theory, polyvagal theory, offers on where to touch and how?
Well, let's say what the theory tells us is more like when to touch. So in a sense, when you become a polyvagal informed therapist or clinician, what are you doing? You're evaluating the autonomic state of your client. How are you doing that? You're observing, you're listening to their voice, you're listening to the intonation of their voice, their facial expressivity, and their muscle tone. And what you tend to see, and I'll use this as body worker terminology, tightly wrapped people and people that are more accessible. And you already know intuitively that tightly wrapped person is going to take some time to work with. And so what we've done in that, you've made a polyvagal informed decision. You said that body that's like this is in a state of threat and defense. why would that body in that state allow me to dig in and manipulate?
Mm-hmm.
You're saying we need to take into account the autonomic state, and the question is timing and when,
Yeah.
and how we do it, not so much where. Because that'd be the simplistic takeaway. What we've talked about so far is, oh yeah, we should always work the diaphragm and the face. But you're saying it's much more nuanced than that.
It's extraordinarily nuanced. And the point is that I've learned from the gifted therapists, whether they were body workers or psychotherapists. What do? They make their clients feel safe or at ease, whatever term you want to use. But if you're a body worker, what does that mean to the tissue? It means it's pliable, it's accessible. And used to love the term tightly wrapped. It just
I like that.
it told me so much about the state of the client.
Mm-hmm.
It should never be interpreted as intention on the part of the client, but reflecting that the client's in the state of defensiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And basically is locked into states of chronic threat. The body is doing what it's supposed to do in that state, and that is not give you access.
So, yeah, along those lines, do you have suggestions or ways? Because again, this is kind of getting back to Till's point about the practicality of people wanting to know, like, what do I actually do, or how do I do this clinically? Any hints or suggestions about, for the people who may not be terribly familiar with some of these concepts, how do they make those evaluations? Like, how do they recognize the tightly wrapped person, or how do they know, what to do or what to do when, kind of thing?
Well, I would say that, I mean, this is not to be dismissive or evaluative, but everyone who is engaging with humans, whether you're a teacher or you're a psychotherapist or a body worker, should be aware of the state of the other,
Mm-hmm.
And so in a sense, understanding that it's not do what I tell you, but I have, as a therapist or a teacher, I have an understanding that the state you're in determines literally the range that you can even follow the instructions
Yeah.
or make sense of it. The problem, again, this is the big problem, is that we're not schooled into thinking about our physiological state. We're very schooled into thinking that our behavior and even our feelings are dependent upon intentions. And we think we control intentions. So when a person gets on the table in your world, they have an intention for someone to work on them. They may have the intellectual intention, but their body may not be accessible.
Yeah.
And so the first step in any form of therapy is a type of what I call body awareness. And this goes back to another journey. So in the 80s, I actually was involved with the Rolfing Society, or whatever, institute rather. And Dick, who would be Demerly, Richard Demerly, who was Ida's son, who was a NIH. He ran a lab in biomedical engineering, and he was in charge of research. And actually, we became friends. And his daughter actually worked in my wife's laboratory. So it was kind of a small world phenomenon. But the real part of the story is that I started to develop a subjective test, and it later evolved into what's called the Body Perception Questionnaire. It's available for free on a website called the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium. But what the test was for, so they asked me the question, how would you do research in Rolfing? And everyone was about, we need to put electrodes on, we need to measure this. I said, do you even know if people, how they feel? What are their feelings? Yeah, basically there was no knowledge base. So no one is set up these items. So I worked on setting this up, and it took, actually, I did a rough one in the early 90s, but actually I revisited I think it was 2013 or 14, I revisited the data set and the items, and we actually did all the complex psychometrics and revised the test. And there are over 500 peer-reviewed papers using this test now. And it basically seems to be a pretty good proxy for putting electrodes on. So in a sense, rather than spending your money measuring physiology, ask them these questions, and then it basically gives you a sense of their autonomic reactivity.
There's
And
some lovely irony there about the body workers hearing from the scientists to pay more attention to feelings and less to the electrodes.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like there's a different level of data that you can get, and that data can be a good proxy for the physiology. And the way I like to view the term, there's a term I use a lot called homeostasis, and that's when our body literally is doing what it's supposed to do, supporting health, growth, and restoration. But when our body is doing what it's supposed to do, it forms a platform upon which we can feel safe. It doesn't mean we do feel safe. And what we're seeing, of course, in a traumatized world, which we live in, is that many people don't feel safe. And this is manifested in the disruption of their bodily processes, gut problems, heart problems, tissue problems. And you see it in structural problems or somatic issues. And the point is, people, when you start explaining and understanding that when their body moves more into a homeostatic state of supporting health, growth, and restoration, and even sociality as a homeostatic process, then they have the possibility of feeling safe in their body. And that means then their tissue becomes accessible to others.
And we do that as just as organisms, but we also do specific as body workers. We track each other's nervous systems and
Yeah.
states, both consciously and intuitively. How could we get even better as body workers at sensing and responding to those things we track?
Well, it's interesting. You might even just use the scale and do a self-study on it. And so it helps you map where you are. And a lot of therapists, where polyvagal theory has really gotten traction within the trauma world of trauma therapists, is not just tracking the client, but tracking the therapist as well.
So you a scale, a tracking on a scale of how would that go?
Well, you go through the items and you basically say, this is where, and then the items provide you with a metric. And fortunately, the metric is normed. We now have we have it on several thousand, so we know normative data. What was interesting is that there was a study recently published on within the past few years on body psychotherapists in their body perception question, the autonomic state versus normative people. So, and the relationship between trauma, the autonomic reactivity with the body perception questionnaire, and how being a body psychotherapist mediated that relationship between trauma history and autonomic reactivity. So trauma history normally maps into being less well regulated. But what was interesting is that the body psychotherapists, even though they had more trauma historically than the normative people, the autonomic nervous system was more regulated using this questionnaire. So you start understanding that working with people and interacting on this very personal level that body psychotherapists or somatic workers are, has not only helpful to others, it has a reciprocal regulatory component on therapists.
It calms us down as well. What kind of items are on the questionnaire? What are the specifics being tracked?
Well, it's basically asking you things like, do you have trouble swallowing? It talks about your gut issue. It talks about sweating. And basically, it's structured to deal with above the diaphragm and below the diaphragm reactions. But in general, if we basically use both of those together, we get a very robust measure. What was also interesting about that measure, a body, let's call it autonomic reactivity from the body perception questionnaire, is that during COVID, we did a study looking at trauma history, symptoms during COVID, and the body perception questionnaire. And trauma history basically mapped into more emotional problems during COVID without getting COVID. This was the early spring 2020. However, if you take the path from trauma through autonomic reactivity to symptoms, it was like 3 times more of the variance of the symptomatology was predicted if you knew their autonomic state. Basically, if you have trauma history and your autonomic state is retuned to be defensive, you have a lot of bad symptoms. If you have a trauma history and just that is a direct effect, it's there. But the real one is what happened to your autonomic nervous system. So rather than thinking about trauma as an event, we think about it as a reaction to an event. meaning that some people can be devastated, some people not. And the other part that's important is once we realize that a traumatic event may not be traumatic for one person, we then ask this other question: what if an event changes autonomic reactivity like a traumatic event would, but doesn't appear to be traumatic to someone else? And you're getting clients like that where their bodies got retuned by, let's say, being humiliated in public or being embarrassed or doing something where their nervous system incorporated it as a life threat.
That's such an important point. And I think probably I'm listening to you talk and realizing this is something else I learned from you. Thinking about trauma as an event rather than as a thing. When people talk about trauma being in the body, that's a useful metaphor, but it's also really helpful for me to think about it as a process or a recovery or a response to something that happened rather than a physical thing that's in there.
Yeah.
And that map you've just given us about we're helping people find safety again, find that, that process in themselves rather than squeezing the trauma out of their muscle is really
Well,
useful.
it's interesting. Okay, so let's go back to my own relationship with Rolfing, which is really my first one.
Yeah.
I basically said, oh, this is pretty nifty. However, does it stick?
Uh-huh.
Which is the real question. And this is where the neural part of the story comes in. The structural part works, the body feels better. But you know what bodies do when they're kind of used to being in states of defense? They go back to that.
Yeah.
And the other part that I've learned, and this is through my acoustic interventions that I developed by just merely trying to create stealth methods of signaling safety. So, Rolfing is a lot of intentionality on the therapist. And it's also, there's a personal element of it that the people are now exposed. And many people under threat don't want to be close to others. So I had the idea, can I signal the nervous system to feel safe? And then would it just be open and then spontaneously engaging to other? And this is, in a sense, more about me than about you or many of my colleagues. I don't like to engage on certain levels, but if someone engages me, I'm fine. So it's like I have this kind of respect for this boundary. And so if I can signal that I'm safe and the person engages me, I'm all for the play. I'm in there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happened is that this worked great with kids, neurodivergent and others. They start to engage. They say, how are you? I love you, mommy, all these things. Then we moved it into the trauma world because it seemed like the obvious place. And for many people, it was extraordinarily helpful. But those with, we can use the term complex, deep trauma, like early childhood, really profound traumas, these individuals that they listened to, they became accessible. And then their body had that feeling of what we would call openness. And then the interoception, that feeling triggered in their brain an association that is the most dangerous feeling they could ever have. And they were out of the room. And actually, this is very much linked to how somatic experiencing works. That what Peter discovered is that you can do titration, move them in and out. And that's what the people did with the acoustic stimulus they called safe and sound protocol. And so that you signal the body and then the person learns what that feeling is. And then the reactivity to that feeling through interoception becomes ameliorated.
So your safe and sound protocol is an acoustic domain, if I remember right. And it's will anything you want us to know about that before we move on?
Yeah, basically it's based on the principle that there's certain intonations, prosodic features of human speech, that our nervous system unambiguously identifies as safeties. Like, how do you calm a baby?
Mm-hmm.
How do you encourage your cat or dog to come close to you? It's all going to be this melodic voice. So the nervous system has no choice. But now it happens, it basically works in the area of the brainstem that regulates the vagus or the ventral vagal areas of facial expressivity, listening to melodic voices, and the prosodic intonation of one's own voice is a vagal So pharyngeal nerves are vagal. So the issue, but they're not cardioinhibitory. They're vagal though. So the issue is that this whole system of calming our heart is really linked to facial expressivity, the muscles of our middle ear that enable us to hear human voice and to dampen background sounds. Now, as we start talking about muscles, we already know there's going to be cranial fascia, you see? And we know that now it's going to be part of a feedback loop because that cranial fascia is loaded with sensory afferents, and that those afferents are now going to go to areas that are calming areas and basically regulate cardioinhibitory slowing circuits.
We hear a lot these days about vagal stimulation. And you have a suggestion about how hands-on therapists would think about the vagal nerve. Is that something we are stimulating? Is that a helpful way for us to think about it?
Well, you see, the conceptualization of that is, I was going to use the word pretty raw, because they're not really conveying what you're really doing. They're making fostering a belief system that if you get your hands on the vagus, you have control of your body.
Right.
The irony of all this is that the part of the vagus that you're stimulating is the sensory part. It's going into the brainstem. And what are those signals being interpreted as? They're signals of safety. Now, what that means is that if you have an understanding of what those signals are, you don't have to necessarily port them in through electrical or stimulation of the vagus. You could rock people. You could have posture shifts. You could use sounds, and that's really what I've been doing, is a sense rhythmic sounds, and even breathing manipulations will impact on the vagus. So the idea is, don't think of hacking the vagus. Think about getting signals of rhythmicity and safety into the brainstem so that the brainstem can now move out of defense.
Move down,
Now,
deregulate.
the important part of this, and this is very subjective because most people understand it, when the brainstem calms down and is in its homeostatic level, it literally frees the cortex to do interesting things, which could be creativity, dreaming, visions, whatever you want to do. In general, we're using our cortex as an inhibitory organ inhibiting our brainstem. And in fact, the philosophy of Western society tells us that. It notion of don't do this, don't do that, inhibit drives, inhibit feelings. That's cortical inhibition of foundational biological systems. And that's what we're using our cortex for. Now, what if we gave it permission to do what it really evolved to do, solve problems?
The cortex is a problem solver.
Yeah.
That.
The
And I think-
brainstem is not. The brainstem is it enables us to survive, but it's not a problem solver.
Yeah. I think, too, you've really hit on a key thing that's really valuable for a lot of body workers and manual therapists to tune into, is this idea, because there, as Till mentioned, we do hear this a lot with, I guess it's just more of a sort of a structural mindset of people talking about things like emotions being stored in a particular tissue or some place in the body. And realistically, maybe it's a pathway process of understanding that it's not like something gets stuck or stored somewhere, but there's a way to tap into the effects of what happened, either through trauma, emotion, or whatever,
Here, this is actually, it's a very important question leading to I would say, more refined thinking about what we're talking about. It's even like my good friend Bessel van der Kolk. What's the title of his book? The Body Keeps the Score. Well, it's not really even the body that keeps the score. It's really the brainstem. So in the sense that the circuits that are monitoring the organs and the tissue have basically got locked into certain positions. If we can think of that type of feedback loop, we need to think more in terms of feedback loops and we even understand that. Now, I know that in the somatic world, there's always been this conflict or contradiction when we start moving into medicine or basic medicine, because basic medicine does not incorporate in treatment of people feedback loops. So it's very aphysiological and in many ways not very scientific. So it thinks that if you have something that acutely works, it will be useful for the chronic case, and it's certainly not. The mechanisms underneath chronic illness or chronic pain are very different than acute illness and acute pain.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, that part of the entree why people come for manipulations or massage is that traditional treatments or pharmaceuticals don't solve their problems. So the issue is the feedback loop that becomes the critical issue of understanding. So we need the storage. Your point, Whitney, about not or locking our emotions being locked in tissue. The tissue is involved, but it's not the seat of it. The way, because we're not, this is even the issue like with fascia. Fascia, let's assume that fascia loses pliability, or gets ripped and it's loaded with sensory afferents. What are those sensory afferents going to be sending, and where are they sending it? Well, if you injure the tissue and the tissue is sending signals of being injured, it's in a way locked into that tissue. But that's not it. But the issue is when it's acute, the body learns about recovery. When it's chronic, the tissue is no longer the source even of the stimulation. It's, quote, a higher brain learned relationship. That becomes the confusing thing. And this is why manipulation works even with chronic illness, is that in a sense, creates a repatterning of that sensory information that disrupts, in a sense, when people get chronic pain, they are going to, in a sense, change the neuromuscular tone of their body to support that pain. And this is where the manipulation, you reach in, you, in a sense, change that flow. And then when you stop it, the body will often go right back. But if you do this slowly enough times, there's what I call neural exercises that are going on. And I think if we start thinking of the sensory relationship between the tissue and the feeling, as opposed to saying the feeling is locked in the tissue.
Yeah. It's almost like a metaphor of maybe like a stereo system or something like that, where we keep trying to change the music by doing something to the speakers instead of changing the source at the amplifier or something.
Yeah, it's a good analogy, but the part is we're a dynamic system in which the status of the organs, the status of the tissue affect everything upstream, and the upstream stuff can affect everything downstream.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful quote from a Nobel laureate in 1949 by name of Walter Hess. And I often read the first paragraph of his Nobel speech, because he really says, everyone has always known that everything is connected to everything in our nervous system, basically. That newer circuits are dependent upon older ones. It's really a beautiful couple of phrases. I often would read this in a talk, and I put it in some papers, and I would say that if I made that statement in a grant proposal, they would not even consider the grant proposal. And in a sense, the guy, he took the liberty at his Nobel Prize speech to basically say this, but it really forces the individual out of this deterministic, simple causal model into a more complex model in which simple old feedback loops influence new ones, and new ones can influence old ones. So it's this intertwining of complexity, and in a sense, forcing us to try to break down that hierarchy.
And with all, let's say, with all the complexity that's grown up around polyvagal theory, can you say something to us about intuition, or the role of intuition to the therapist, moment-to-moment decision making in a way?
Okay, so here's what I would say is that the insightful therapist is polyvagal informed, whether they know it or not. So what the theory gives the insightful therapist is a language to understand what their insight is teaching them, because their body is responding to their clients. And, there's kind of this subset or subcurrent within bodywork of, quote, healers or this or that. The answer is there's reality to really what that is. And it's not mystical, although some people want to use that channel. It's a degree of sensitivity to the other, an awareness of the other's body, whether one feels it with their hands or feels it literally with their gut.
Mhm.
You also talk about how our own nervous system shapes the interaction or and plays into the interaction. Can you tell us something about that as body work?
Yeah, so I look at you and I know how you shape the interactions with people. Just, I mean, I'm going to direct the audience to your face. And in fact, your face is the upper part of your face, your eyes, the ability your eyes open while you are providing accessibility in your presence.
Mm.
Now, not everyone has, I would say, that range and that capacity, but for you, it just blooms right out there. So the part is that we need to understand that we are broadcasters of our own physiological state, and that impacts on others. And in a way, it's a strange type of responsibility. I remember as a faculty member with a relatively large lab, telling my lab group to basically discount my expression for the days because I just got a bad review on a grant. It's like, yeah, it's like I could feel it in my body. And but you tell people it's not you, it's how I'm feeling. It may be helpful, but it's not enough.
No.
They're still going to respond to you as if you're evaluating them and your expressions are reflecting something they did. In a lot of our life, we're not well schooled at understanding and respecting and honoring our own physiological state. And as to come directly at your question,
Mm.
our state really is being broadcast to everyone in our proximity. And in terms of our tone of voice, our facial expressivity, our gentleness, our openness, I'd like to, in a sense, summarize this in a very simple way. We have only one gift to give, and that's our own accessibility. And what does that really mean? It means when we broadcast that we're accessible to other, we're there in their space. It's the gift that keeps giving back endlessly.
Lovely. Couple more questions I hope to get to, but I wanted to give you a chance to tell us something about interoception, neuroception, the importance of those, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. So there's no problem in building a model that basically tracked the phylogeny, the evolutionary history of the autonomic nervous system. There was no problem in saying there's a hierarchy because the systems are developed later. But there was a problem in how do we come up with a construct that enables us to say, when this happens, the system shifts state. I had no mechanism. And so neuroception became the nervous system's mechanism, literally, to move us to different states. It was not, and this became an internal dialogue with myself. I wanted to use perceived danger, perceive this, perceive safety, but couldn't use it because perception is ambiguous. People say, well, what if I missed it? Then I didn't perceive it. Then they start feeling bad. They start thinking that perception includes a dimension of intentionality, which it does in our language. So I really wanted a system of detection that was not perception, that attributed to a level of our nervous system that was outside of our awareness. Therefore,
That's
we
what
did.
neuroception is
Yeah. So therefore, it's not
ability to assess safety.
my responsibility. It's my responsibility to learn about what I react to, but the reaction is not under my control. Now, we're fine with that with startle reflexes or pain reactions, but I want to, in a sense, give us a different dimensionality of neuroception, and that was where safety. So like the intonation of a mother calming her baby with the voice, that's neuroception of safety.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the danger side is across with virtually all living organisms, even down to single cell or plants or leaves. When when a leaf is chewed upon, there's actually a reaction within the neurosystem. It's not a very complex neurosystem within plants that starts creating a healing barrier for the damage. So that's a neuroception as well. So the ability to protect after being injured or to detect danger or a threat is a neuroception, but safety is unique. Then I had another problem, and that is everyone thought there was only one defense system, and that was fight, flight, sympathetic. but talk to people within the world of trauma. And they start describing disappearing, passing out, defecating, hitting the floor. And
Spacing out.
yeah. And so, and then you start studying as this comparative physiology, and you start realizing that animals of prey, like mice and guinea pigs and rabbits, they will literally immobilize, and sometimes that immobilization leads to death.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of like pushed out of the literature because people didn't quite understand it. And like there were studies back in the 50s of hopelessness. Actually, it became learned helplessness, but the real work was by Carl Richter at Hopkins, and he put rats in beakers of water and basically waited till they died. And laboratory rats would stay floating or thrashing around until they died of exhaustion. But the wild rats, when put in the water, within 2 minutes, dove to the bottom and just died. And when they did the autopsies, rather than the hearts being contracted, which is sympathetic, they were engorged. They had a vagal death. So there was a totally different model. And in fact, he put electrodes on some of these rats, and the heart rates went slower, and then stopped. So it was really these amazing stories of what I would call the precursors for many of the features of polyvagal theory, long before polyvagal theory occurred.
And so, for example, when we look at the reactions that clients or people have with experiences, it's never one of these things exclusively. It seems like there can be varying different degrees of each of those things that are left within them as the remnants of that experience.
The one remnant I think stays is the gut. I think people who have gut problems it's part of this dorsal vagus life threat reaction. And even though you may not get the slowing of the heart rate, you will almost universally see digestive issues.
Interesting.
Okay, so big question. A lot of us are wondering about this. What about the larger systems around us where we might feel uncertain or threatened? How do we find safety in an unsafe world? Should we just swim to the bottom and freeze? Do we struggle on the top as long as we
can?
Well,
it depends on if you live within social media or cable news. And the answer is it's totally overwhelming. But the pragmatic aspect is that we've been a traumatized species. We always have been under threat. And survival was always finding enough or sufficient number of individuals with whom you felt safe enough to give up that hypervigilance and defensiveness. We are a very flexible species. It's not that life threat and chronic and stress from work or environments or cable news, we can't deal with it. We can't deal with it 24/7. We need some safe time. And that becomes a way in which we teach our children or teach our colleagues how to function. I'll give you an example of when I saw total chaos. I was doing a webinar for Israeli therapists after Hamas intrusion. And they wanted some advice about how to treat, to do things. However, within a few minutes, I realized these people were broadcasting their state, and their state was not welcoming or comfortable. They were in this state of anger and fear. It was really an amazing reaction. It was quite justified. They were now fearful because their concept of safety had been totally violated, and they were angry. And so the first part of our discussion with them was, you need to honor those reactions. They're real. They're your own body. And you need to understand that you can't do what you think you need to do when you're broadcasting that. And this is really, I think, the basic question here. When you're broadcasting fear and anger, you can't be a therapist. So what are your choices? Your choices, you can't say, I'm not going to be a therapist and I'm not going to broadcast fear and anger. But that's not a top-down decision. So it means that they have to enable certain relationships, like with colleagues. They'll enable them to co-regulate, calm down, maybe fewer hours of therapy, some walk and talks with their colleagues. But they have to understand that they have to co-regulate each other so they can provide the resource for those outside their clinic. It's a
It's so
heavy,
important. It's such
yeah,
a solitary line of work we're in as individual
yeah.
practitioners.
Well, you're internalized this, first of all, this gift. You have gifts in this domain of helping and making people feel better. However, your ability to express those gifts are totally dependent upon your physiological state and what you broadcast to the other. And again, we keep thinking that everything we do is manualized. And even though it may be harder today for me to do it, I will still do it. But that being harder to do, you're now broadcasting the stress and duress that you're under. And the client's body doesn't want to hear that.
So we need colleagues to co-regulate with. We need
It's kind of like saying
relationships
it's
in
a kind of a
person.
simple term. We need safe friends. It's like
Right.
it's kind of like it's outrageously simple that as a species we can be as competitive as we want or need to be, but we need safe places and safe friendships.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I hope
Curious on
this-
your thoughts. Sorry, Tel, just for one quick second.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Curious on your thoughts about this idea of looking for safety and talking about needing and having the great benefit of other colleagues around us to help us get to that place. Because we do operate in such a solitary type of work situation, do you think it's feasible for people to achieve that through their social media channels, for example, of their networks and their Facebook groups, or the things where they have similar colleagues who are going through other types of things? Do you think we can do that in that being not in the same space with each other kind of place, where we don't see facial expressions and things like that?
So this may be generational. In my generation would say not really. If I take it from an informed view, because I do have my children are quite grown up and they're professionals, and they are basically telling me that the social world is different now than it was. And the answer is really we need to take an appraisal of what type of social nourishment, we'll use that word, social nourishment, your nervous system needs. And I think for many of us, and I put myself in that category, the pandemic was a severe challenge to my nervous system. And it was a retuning that really made me feel more comfortable in obtaining some social reinforcement or nourishment from Zoom. Or from what you're talking about, Facebook issues. In general, I think the efficient one is being safe in the presence of another. And this is better. Okay, I will say that, like, being online with the two of you is better than not meeting you. But I think if we were around a table with a cup of coffee, it would be even better.
Yeah.
I
Makes
really
sense.
hope that this conversation put out as a podcast is helping some people find safety, find some calming in themselves. I know it has for me this time with you. Before we wrap up, I wonder if you want to tell us about your new book and anything else you want to recommend for listeners who want to know more about your work.
I have to go say which two. Okay, so the thing I do want to send you towards, and that is a paper called Polyvagal Theory, A Science of Safety. It's a Frontiers open access paper, and I think it will be very, very helpful to this community. There's a couple of books that have come out, actually 3 books have come out in the last, actually, I'm embarrassed, 4 books in the past few years. The one I was just mentioning to you earlier was an edited book on somatic therapies. I think that one is very, very linked to your community. And there are something like 30 chapters. There's short chapters. They're 5,000 words. The book is it's a hefty book, but it crosses many of the disciplines that deal with basically body psychotherapy. So there's some Rolfing in there. There's basically a somatic experience. There are a lot of things in there that this community would find of interest. And the part that I like is, I actually like the preface I wrote, which described my relationship with the somatic world and about how I was brought into it from Peter Levine and how I viewed myself as being in the shadows. And then I was given an award by the USABP, the United States Association for Body Psychotherapy, as a Pioneer Award. And I was kind of like, what's this about? Yeah. And so I had to do a reappraisal about what was my, let's say, impact within the somatic field. And likewise, I was asked to be a co-editor on this book. And initially I said, I'll be helpful, I'll get you a contract, but this is your book. But I ended up basically recruiting, I would say, a significant portion of the authors. And to my surprise, I would say 80% of the chapters discuss polyvagal theory in it. So I started to have a different sense of what these ideas that I've been talking about in the somatic world have actually gained some traction. And I just felt as a privileged visitor in the somatic world, I enjoyed it.
You have been hugely influential, and I can't think of anybody else that would, deserve the prize more than you. What's the name of the book?
Not a good thing to ask me.
We'll look it up.
Yeah, it's a Norton book. It's on Amazon. The first author is Grossman, and I'm the third editor. It's easy to find. There's another book that came out within a couple months ago called The Safe and Sound Protocol, and this is a book that I wrote with my collaborator Karen Ondecker. And this book is quite interesting because it's about the acoustic intervention. But if you were to read it, you'd see a lot of steps and clinical cases that sound very much like what you do as somatic people. Also, there are a few chapters of somatic people in that about case studies. So there's not, we wrote the book, but they're case studies, and the therapists basically help provide the information for the case studies. And then let's see, there's a readable book that came out about a year and a half ago, which I wrote with my son Seth. It's called Our Polyvagal World. Very readable because he's a journalist. So he was able to translate his father's work. And it's all out there now. It's there now.
Wonderful.
Those are some great resources. We'll make sure we look them all up and get them into the show notes.
The one I would basically say that the community would, the two things. One is the somatic edited book fits very nicely. The other one is the Polyvagal Theory, A Science of Safety. I think crosses a lot of the domains and basically provides a very, I wouldn't say succinct, I would say readable of what the major points of what our discussion has been about today.
We'll get those looked up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been absolutely wonderful chatting with you and talking about that. All kinds of great things to open up and look into in greater detail.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. And on that note, Books of Discovery has been a part of the massage and body therapy community for over 25 years. Nearly 3,000 schools around the globe teach with their textbooks, e-textbooks, and digital resources. Books of Discovery likes to say that learning adventures start here, and they find that same spirit here on the Thinking Practitioner podcast and are proud to support our work, knowing that we share the mission to bring the massage and bodywork community thought-provoking and enlivening content that advances our profession.
Instructors of manual therapy education programs can request complimentary copies of Books of Discovery's textbooks for review use in their programs. Listeners can explore their collection of learning resources for anatomy, pathology, kinesiology, physiology, ethics, and business mastery at booksofdiscovery.com, where you as a listener can save 15% by entering thinking at checkout. And I also want to thank the Fascial Research Congress happening August 10th to 14th of 2025 in New Orleans, where Dr. Porges is a keynote speaker. They are offering you, Thinking Practitioner listeners, $100 off on your enrollment by entering the word thinking at checkout. Just go to frscongress.org.
And we would like to say thanks to all of our listeners and to our sponsors. You can stop by our sites for the video show notes, transcripts, and any extras. You can find that over on my site at academyofclinicalmassage.com. Till, where can they find that for you?
Advanced-trainings.com. Whitney and I want to hear your ideas or input or feedback about the show. Just email us at info@thethinkingpractitioner.com. Include some really expressive emojis of your face to give us nice safety cues that we
All
can
right, there we go.
incorporate your feedback. Or look for us on social media and YouTube. Don't spend too much time there, but go there to send us a little note. I am at Till Luchau, my name. Whitney, where can people find you?
Also under my name, Whitney Lowe, over there, and we'd really appreciate it if you would rate us on Spotify or Apple Podcast, as it does help other people find the show or wherever you happen to listen. So please take a few seconds to do that. And as always, thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for sharing some time with us. Do be sure to share the word and tell a friend. And thank again, Dr. Porges, for this wonderful and inspiring conversation. It was great visiting with you today.
Well, thank you very much.